One. Right.
We actually asked you to join. Yeah, no. Right. Yes. I hear you. Is it good? I lost my phone. I texted my it's not very good. I've got it. I'm up. He doesn't talk to me. Does he send you notes? I do know weeks ago, but I don't exactly have he wants to Okay. Okay. Can I use this? You can use it. It's not full. Is it? Okay. Yeah. How you been? Yeah, so I just wanted to confirm. It's in there, but yeah.
We're going to start, or yeah? Any more?
Okay, come in, find a seat. We're going to kick this off in about 10 seconds.
So you can use your credit card. They love the square reader, and they
Okay, everybody, let's start. My name's Liam Ward. I'm a lecturer here. Sorry. Big heckle already. Where was I? That's right, my name. My name's Liam Ward. I'm a lecturer here in the School of Media and Communication, and I've been asked, and it's a bit of an honour, to introduce tonight's forum. This is obviously a forum on behalf of Free Palestine Melbourne and the Australian Jewish Democratic Society. It is, of course, being conducted on stolen lands. This RMIT University occupies the lands of the people of the Woiwurrung and Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects, obviously, to elders past and present, and extend our solidarity to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people ongoing fight for justice right across this continent. Now, I've been asked to introduce.
those seats over there are very dangerous. How can we stop people sitting on them?
Yeah, if the people around them can just play some kind of shepherding role, maybe that's the solution. Yes, as I said, I've been asked to introduce the speakers, which sort of seems like a pointless exercise, because I could say these people need no introduction, but nonetheless, I will do some introductions. I've got some bios here which I will read. I also want to tell you just a very brief outline of the groups behind the forum. So Free Palestine Melbourne is a grassroots anti-apartheid organisation established in 2020 with the aim of promoting across Melbourne an awareness of the Palestinian struggle for freedom. The Australian Jewish Democratic Society is a community group established in 1984 to provide a progressive voice among Jews and a Jewish voice among progressives. This forum tonight is the first time that these two organisations have cooperated in putting on an event in which Jewish and Palestinian writers can have a nuanced discussion about issues of human rights, identity, and the significance of the Israel-Palestine conflict in international affairs. Following this discussion, our chair will invite the audience to ask questions and obviously to promote free debate on what can be broad-ranging issues. The panellists are willing to take any questions on any topic, but we will not be tolerating anything, any disruptive behaviour, any racist comments or anything along those lines. The chair and facilitator of this evening's forum is Noura Mansour. According to the bio here, which I'm going to read, Noura is a Palestinian educator, writer, activist, and community organiser from Accra City. She studied political science and education and received Masters in International Relations from Haifa University. Noura has worked in community development with NGOs in Jerusalem, West Bank, 48 Palestine. She's been heavily involved with international NGOs and solidarity movements in South Korea and Australia, where she's now based and works as the community organising and advocacy lead with Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. Noura is also a debate trainer, a policy member with Al Shabaka Network, and a mother of two boys, 6-year-old Rami and 4-year-old Razi, who keep her active, fit, and above all, extremely grateful. And it's not in the bio, but I also heard possibly sick from time to time. It's that season, isn't it? Noura will be interviewing Antony Loewenstein and Sara Saleh. Now, Antony, of course, is an independent journalist, best-selling author, filmmaker, and co-founder of Declassified Australia. He's written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, and many others. His latest book the Palestine Laboratory, which you can get on the desk. His other books include Pills, Powder and Smoke, Disaster Capitalism, and My Israel Question. His documentary films include Disaster Capitalism and Al Jazeera English films, West Africa's Opioid Crisis and Under the Cover of COVID. He was based in East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. Sara is a writer, human rights lawyer, organiser, and the daughter of migrants from Palestine, Egypt, and Lebanon, living on Vigigal land. She is the co-editor of the groundbreaking 29 anthology, Arab Australian Other. The poems, short stories, and essays have been published widely in English and Arabic, and she performs and has run workshops in countless classrooms, community spaces, and festivals across the country. Sara is the recipient of the inaugural Affirm Fellowship for Sweatshop Writers, amongst other honours and awards. She made history as the first poet to win both the Australian Book Review's 2021 Peter Porter Poetry Prize and the Overland Judith Wright Poetry Prize 2020. Her debut novel, the song is yet to come. Her debut novel, Songs for the Dead and the Living, and a full-length poetry collection, The Flotation of Girls, are out in 2023. Within the Palestinian movement, Sara is committed to elevating youth and building communities of resistance grounded in the interconnectedness of Indigenous struggles for self-determination. As a grassroots organiser, she has campaigned tirelessly for Palestinian rights on so many intersecting fronts. Highlights include the Boycott Sydney Festival campaign and organising for Black Palestinian solidarity. Both Antony and Sara will be available to sign copies of their books, which are both available over there. And that's it from me, according to my notes. So I'll ask everyone to welcome our guest speakers, Antony Loewenstein and Sara Saleh.
Thank you, Liam. Welcome, everyone. As Liam mentioned, I put on this voice specifically for this evening. Not that I'm sick, not that one of my kids' babies some random daycare germs, but welcome everyone once again. I would like to start by thanking the organisers, Free Palestine Melbourne and the Australian Jewish Democratic Society for organising this event. To start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to others past and present. I'd also like to, living and working on stolen land, coming from a stolen land, I would like to invite everyone to reflect, to continue to reflect on the various ways in which settler colonialism continues to manifest here in Australia, on this continent, in Nahr, but also in Nablus, in Akka, in Ghazi, in Al-Quds, back in Palestine. So welcome again. Congratulations both Sara and Antony on your recent release of your books. Sara just released her first book, Songs for the Dead and the Living. And that's such an exciting time, I guess, for a Palestinian young writer to be producing such, important resources, but also paving the way for many others. Antony, congratulations on your bestseller in New Zealand, #1 seller book. Also, what a wonderful resource. Antony's expose details in such intricate way how the Israeli state basically profits from the occupation industry by exporting occupation technology to the rest of the world. So we'll have a conversation. We'll talk about having both of them here. We'll talk about more in terms of what brings both of them together into this event. Aside from the Australian Jewish Democratic Society and Free Palestine Melbourne. But to start, perhaps we can talk about your books. Maybe give us a brief overview of each, your book, why you wrote it, and what is it, the main takeaway that you'd like your readers to take home with them. And because, we're Palestinians who are very sensitive towards minority rights, we'll start with Antony, since you're the minority on the panel.
I also want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I want to thank the organisers, and I'm very happy that these two organisations have joined up, because it seems to make a lot of sense in so many ways to have some Jewish organisations and Palestinian groups to work together on common goals, not just about Palestine but other issues as well. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are here this evening. My book really came out of a long period looking at the issues of disaster capitalism. I spent a lot of time in the last decade writing and researching both a book and a film called Disaster Capitalism, which actually was not about Palestine. It was about people making money from misery in Afghanistan, from the war, from the mining industry, from the refugee immigration industry around the world. People could find both those works easily. And I moved in 2016 with my partner to East Jerusalem. I've been visiting Palestine for a number of years there, never living there, but visiting there, Israel, West Bank and Gaza. And when I moved there in 2016, I was interested in looking at not just what was happening in the conflict per se. There's obviously a need to report and write on what is happening every day, the violence, the occupation, the ethnic cleansing, all that is vital. I'm not minimising journalists who do that. If it's done well, and often it's not, which we can talk about, but if it's done well, it's important. But I want to look at something broader than that. I want to look at the ways in which I was starting to see so many examples of how the Israeli occupation, which by that point was close to 50 years, it is now 56 years, that's since 1967, although many people would argue, including me, that the occupation in many ways began in 1948 in a different way, and I talk about that in the book. But it accelerated after 1967, what I'm referring to. And I looked at the various ways in which Israel has spent those decades refining ways to repress Palestinians, various tools and technologies that are used to repress Palestinians to keep them in their place, so to speak. And what I mean by that in the modern age is things like drones, spyware, facial recognition technology, biometric tools, various other tools and technologies. And that's done to repress Palestinians in Palestine, which is bad enough. But what Israel has done for decades, but it's certainly accelerated since 9/11, is selling all those tools and technologies to huge numbers of nations around the world. In other words, occupation is exported. So I was looking at in this book at least 130 countries in the last half century, so essentially the majority of nations on the planet, have bought a form of Israeli repression to repress their own people, their own minorities, their own dissidents, their own human rights workers. And even nations that on the face of it seem to be critical of the occupation, you might now and then vote against Israel in the UN or put out statements against the settlements. In the end, that matters little, because firstly, Israel has complete impunity in pretty much any international forum. But secondly, because they want these tools of repression. And I could list a multitude of examples which I won't bore you with all now, except to say that it's everything from spyware in Saudi Arabia, weapons in Myanmar, Israel selling weapons to Rwanda during the genocide in 1994, and pretty much any repressive state in the last, well, frankly, 75 years, but particularly half century, Israel has formed some relationship with along so-called defence lines. I just want to finish on this point. It's obviously worth saying that, of course, the US remains the world's biggest arms dealer, number one, proudly American. 40% of the world's weapons come from the US, Israel's about 10. So Israel is not number one, and arguably never will be. But the difference is, and I talk about this a lot in the book, what Israel has done, and I think it really can be an Achilles heel for activism against it if we think cleverly, it's using the occupation and Palestinians as battle-tested. They use that as a battle-tested on Palestinians, and when it's promoted and sold globally to democracies and dictatorships, it's said to have worked on Palestinians first. That's what the marketing shows, that's what the communication shows. And I think in some ways what I'm trying to say is both an investigation into this issue and tell people what the hell is going on, but also to say as a warning that in a century that I fear, and I'm not the only one who worries about this, that more and more nations are embracing ethno-nationalism. India being the most obvious example, states that prioritise one people over another. Israel is the model Israel remains the key ethno-nationalist model in the world, which is very attractive to many other nations. Not attractive to this room, perhaps, but attractive to many other nations. And that is something that should concern us and we should fight against.
Good evening, everyone. I also want to echo sentiments that Noura said earlier, and as well as Antony, to say that it is such an honor to be here as a poet and a storyteller and a writer, an activist on land, still on land where that has happened for thousands and thousands of years before, and to be able to honor that in all that I do, or at least try to. And I also want to thank the organizers and everyone. I know it takes a village to put events like this together and a lot of work behind the scenes, so I'm really grateful to be here and grateful to you all for choosing to spend your Tuesday evening with us in freezing Melbourne. To answer your question, Noura, so Songs for the Dead and the Living, which is my debut novel, is actually about this kind of large and loving and chaotic family, the Husseinis, who are living as undocumented Palestinians, Palestinian refugees, so to speak, in Lebanon during the Civil War. And it is because of the war that is going on at the time that they find themselves forced to flee once again, forced into exile in search of safety, first from Palestine, then from Lebanon, and they find their way to Egypt, and then finally to make their way to Australia. So the book is really told through the youngest daughter, Jamila, and she, like most teenagers, is someone who is, wanting to live her best life and wanting to go out there and have dreams and have friends and pursue goals. And so for her, that freedom and that dreaming is really in, I guess, conflict or in tension with the fact that she still needs to hold on to her family for safety, for security, especially amidst the backdrop of war, civil war, and conflict. And so ultimately, we're following Jamila around the world, I guess, or from one side of it to the other, as she tries to figure herself out and find a place that perhaps she can be fully herself and fully free. And the question is, will she find it? Well, you'll have to tune in to the book. But I guess I wrote this novel for so many reasons, I can't tell you, but I will share 3 of them. And the first being that I think as a Palestinian, we for a very long time and still are contending with this global entity, this colonial project that has tentacles all around the world and is essentially invested in our erasure, whether that's through mainstream media, as we know, or through representation, through politics and policy. So when you are up against, your very existence, your identity, your memory, your culture is at stake, we have found ways to keep going, to remember, to sort of pass on our stories as inheritance and as heirlooms. So for me, writing our stories is critical as part of resistance, but also I think it's just as important to be able to not just write against, or in response through that kind of gaze, through the Israeli or colonial gaze, as though we only exist on their terms or in like those parameters, but to transcend that and to write to the multiplicity and the fullness of the Palestinian experience. That's why in the book you see, for example, the issue of Palestinians and their treatment in Lebanon as a topic, or gender relations in the families, also a topic, and just the joy of sisterhood and family and cousins and aunties. So really just transcending and offering a complex, messy portrayal of these characters and of these families, wherever they may be, all the way from, as I said, the paint shop in Beit Samra, Beirut to Sydney. So for me, I think being Palestinian, that is something that I'm going to do, even though we are constantly invisibilized and silenced. Sharing our stories, we are not invisible and we are not silent, and we'll continue to do that, and I'll continue to write. So the second reason has a lot to do with my mother's migration story, and I was very inspired by my maternal, my grandmother and my mom and their story and how they sort of came to be, I was reflecting a lot about at the time. It took me 4 years to write, but I was reflecting a lot about how, like, what had to happen, what confluence of events in history, and what people and what things had to take place for me as Sara to be here tonight with you, sharing my story and talking about this. So I was really interested in how one incident, one event, be it the Nakba, which is ongoing, but one particular incident in relation to that can literally decide the trajectory of our whole lives. It can dictate the parameters and the circumstances within which we make decisions. So I was really kind of fixated on that and inspired by my mom and just thinking, what is my mom's origin story? And so speaking to her and having, coffee conversations and sharing stories was something that really, I guess, we got to bond over a lot when I was researching this, and something that kind of gave us, she felt like she could talk about these layers of trauma a lot more because we had this tangible kind of project, that it wasn't just enough for her to talk about it because there was a lot of silence and shame around being Palestinian, particularly in Lebanon. So this was an opportunity for us to almost get closer, and I found out stories that, I was like, Mom, I've known you for 30 years. How did I not know that this happened to you growing up? And so that was another reason, I think, that really kind of inspired me to write this. It is not the book I started out to write, mind you, but it was persistent. And I guess the last reason is probably the Civil War. Though the world and the Civil War has faded from the world's memory, I think for a lot of us, we can feel its consequences and its, the scars on our psyche to this day. There are people who haven't found their missing or don't know what happened, and we see that in Lebanon constantly play out, day in, day out. And so for me, this is part of that lament, but also a love letter to the cities that I write about in the book as well.
Amazing. Thank you for your brief overview and introduction of the books and why you wrote those books. Identity seems to be a recurring theme. Sara, just to pick up on what you were saying, as a Palestinian, you mentioned that a couple of times. As a Palestinian, I feel like I will continue to do this. I have the duty to do this. To what extent, and identity is obviously, any discussion about identity is very sensitive, and what defines us, what doesn't define us, the way the world perceives us, or how we would like the world to perceive us, how others see us shapes our lived experience, and that kind of also has an impact on our, the people who we become, to a certain extent, because we also have free will and we have, a choice that we could also shape our own identity. So I think, to what extent, and that would be my second question, probably getting, moving away from the book more towards your personal story, to what extent your identities, both of you, like Antony as, a Jewish white Australian man, and Sara as an Arab Muslim woman, to what extent these identities have shaped your work and your views generally, but not just in writing, I would say. And we wear many hats, or many hijabs, as Sara keeps saying. So to what extent those identities that keep recurring have led you to where you are right now, and how does it affect all these roles that you play?
A lot. It's a simple answer, slightly longer answer. Obviously, when I started my journalism career about 20 years ago, it was literally 20 years ago in 2003 when I moved from here to Sydney, the work I started writing about then was really two issues. It was the occupation of Palestine, also it was the Iraq War, which for me as a journalist and as a human was probably one of the most transformative events in my life. I wasn't involved in the war, I wasn't sent there, I didn't report, I reported from much of the Middle East, but never been to Iraq. And the reason I say that is that it transformed my view of journalism and the complicity that so many journalists had then and now in that war, and of course the political class as well. And I started writing about Palestine then. I guess I was writing as a Jew. I wrote as a critical Jew. I was born here in Melbourne, and I felt when I was growing up, I won't rehash my whole history, but the short version was often I felt, not so much when I was a young kid, but as I grew up, that there was deep complicity in a lot of the established Jewish community towards what was happening. It's not unique to Australia, it's happening in many Western countries, many countries in general, US, UK, Europe, and of course the Jewish community is complex. It's not one Jewish community like any community, but the Jewish establishment, the Israel lobby, call it whatever you want, has deep complicity in what is happening in Palestine. I thought that then, I think it just as much now. And I think without that Jewish establishment complicity, you would not have, in my view, what is happening in Palestine. I think it would be a very different picture. I'm not saying it'd be utopia, but it would be different, very, very different. And so I guess initially what pushed me to do this work for a range of reasons was to be a more critical Jewish voice. I wasn't the only one then, I'm not the only one now by any means, but for a variety of reasons, a slight confluence of events, I became quite a major figure on this issue in Australia and elsewhere. And partly as a result of that, I was getting, very much from the beginning, a lot of hate mail and death threats and pretty horrible stuff. And I'm not suggesting in Australia I thought I was likely to be killed. I don't want to exaggerate that. Thankfully, I have a lot of friends and colleagues, and I worked myself in places where journalists often are killed, and thankfully, touch wood, Australia, that has happened, but very, very rarely. But I think I made the decision years ago that I wasn't just going to write about Palestine, partly for that reason. So a lot of the work I've done, though, is very much based around human rights, whether it's, as I said, disaster capitalism, the war in Afghanistan, critical reporting on the drug war, lots of work over the years on issues to do with refugees, immigration. As a reporter, I mean, I see myself as, in some cases, as an activist as well, which is often a conflicting hats to wear. But I think the reason I came back to write about Palestine for this issue was, A, I felt it needed to be written, B, the situation there, I guess living in Palestine seemed to be getting far more egregious. And as finally, I think that I feel, which I guess we might talk about more later, despite the fact that in Palestine itself, in my view, the situation's arguably never been worse. Yes, in 1948 it was probably worse, yes, in 1967, but in general, the situation is accelerating incredibly fast in the utterly wrong direction. Despite that, or maybe because of that, I think in many countries, particularly in the US and elsewhere, there is a shift going on in public opinion around this question. Not just the Jewish community, though, it's happening within that as well, but in the wider community. This is based on public polling, it's not my opinion, this is based on the sense that the sheer overt far-right fascist face of the Israeli government, which has arguably always been there, but is very overt and proud this year, especially with the Netanyahu government, I think is making a lot of people in the West saying, hang on a minute, we're supposed to be supporting these guys? Just remind me why we're doing that again? So, obviously there's lots of reasons why the West does support Israel, which we can talk about later if you want, but in general, on the public opinion, there is a shift. So for me as a Jew, a lot of my work, say, in Afghanistan wasn't particularly as a Jew, it was a human being. Of course, often in certain countries you have to almost hide your Jewish, I mean, not that you could visibly maybe see me as a Jew, although weirdly in Afghanistan I kind of blended in, oddly enough, amongst the Afghan men, which might sound weird, but I looked a bit similar to some of them, there you go. But yes, in some places I didn't proudly say I'm Jewish. I mean, there's no doubt in some countries in the world, including in the Arab Muslim world, there's anti-Semitism. That's real, it exists. In some places actually it's getting worse. And I'm alive to that. Well, I think often the occupation of Palestine is a key driver of that, in my view, and that I think is where I have a responsibility, I think, to try to raise my voice if I'm talking about Palestine as something that I can do something about, that I feel I have a responsibility to either try to push, prod the Jewish community, and in a wider sense to say that there is not just one Jewish view on this issue, which is obvious to this room, but I've lost count in the last 20 years of how many people have said we didn't realise Jews had different views. I mean, it might sound weird in this audience to say that, but that is a common view in the wider community.
So when you answered your question, you know how our identity is always, as Palestinians, it's always either hyper-politicized or depoliticized. There's no, middle ground. You're either portrayed as someone who's constantly, you have to engage in politics and be political all the time. And also, but what that kind of creates that bubble that, restricts our engagement. But also, you're either depoliticized, you're either, that part of your identity being a Palestinian, but also what being a Palestinian means is erased. So maybe you could, if you could talk to that as well.
So the question was how, our identities have informed who we are, I suppose. And that's really funny because, just a quick side note, a couple of weeks ago I was running this retreat from Muslim poets, and it was really special. And the first person who opened the retreat over the weekend was actually Dr. Eugenia Flynn, who might be known to some of you here. She's a really prominent Aboriginal Chinese Muslim woman who does phenomenal work in a lot of the kind of the spaces that we traverse. And so she made us introduce ourselves as part of the opening session, Blackfella style. And I definitely don't want to be co-opting that, only sharing the experience to say how critical and important it was for us in organizing and movement building to understand each other better and more, and to build relationships. The first foundation of that was understanding our lineages, our ancestries, where we come from, who we're mobbed by, who is part of our community. Because once you have these kinds of connections and shared connections, it becomes a lot harder than to, delve into the toxicity that we sometimes see in the lateral violence. And it's not to say that there's no accountability or conflict, but I just found that a really beautiful and grounding and centered, a way to center the retreat as well. But in any case, so so I really have a lot of appreciation for this question, even though I know that talking about identity can be a little bit exhausting and tired and repetitive, and so I wanted to highlight that as to why it's still very critical. When I was 11, I was actually really excited because I was invited to my friend's birthday party, and I spent the weekend, or a few days in the lead up to the weekend, trying to think of what I was going to buy for my friend, and a present, and just what I was going to wear, and what really shiny thing I'm sure somewhere in my closet. And then there was news that sort of went viral before we have modern notions of what viral is. So the original viral photo for me was when 11-year-old Mohammed al-Durra was killed in Gaza. He was shot by Israeli soldiers, occupying forces, and died in his father's arms. And many of you may remember that image. I certainly do. Mohammed was pretty much my age when he was killed, and I was sitting here worrying about a birthday party. Meanwhile, someone who could easily look like my brother or my cousin or a family member was going through that. And I know that is much of the way of the world, but very sadly. But I think for me that was such a watershed moment in my identity, because it made me realize how much privilege I had, being safe despite my shared and mixed backgrounds shared with Muhammad. That I have inherited, this passport that provides a certain level of safety and security. I wasn't living in Australia at the time, I should say, on this colony. I was in the Middle East, and so I had a lot of access and a lot of privilege, and got me thinking about this notion of borders and how absurd it is, how by the luck of the draw we are where we are, and I have access that my cousins and my family members don't have. I can go to places that they literally cannot go to, and they are not worth any more or any less than I am as a human. And so growing up with that, and then having to contend with a post 9/11 world conflict. The Iraq War, of course, was one of the, and Afghanistan, and the instigators. But growing up in this post 9/11 world where your identity was constantly under attack, and where being Arab and Muslim and or Palestinian was very much homogenized and, like a sort of homogenous blob. We were all painted by the same brush, and we were in mainstream media hyper-criminalized, in the very best case, hyper-criminalized and demonized, and women in particular, of course, were also subject to very orientalist and fetishist, I guess, a fetishizing gaze as well. So there were all these depictions of us, and that was sort of the context in which I was growing up, trying to figure out my identity and where I fit in and where I belong, especially as someone with a hyphenated identity and with all these backgrounds. And I think for me, that made me realize just how much we are missing from that narrative and how much I didn't see myself at all, except in these extremely negative representations, and how people told stories for us and about us and talked at us, but we were not given that space to share our own experiences again in a way that was full and human and messy and complex and did that justice. So I think for me, that was really one of the biggest things, contending with that and understanding that my identities ebb and flow and that they're not fixed, and that it is ultimately a construct, a racialized construct, but that I want it to be on my terms. So when people introduce me as an artist, I'm adamant to say, this is my lineage, this is my heritage, this is my ancestry. I'm identifying my positionality in the context that I'm in, but that's because I'm doing it and I'm owning it. Not, that is something that I'm proud of, and I get to decide when to say that. Ultimately, it would be a lot easier if I could just be a writer. A lot of white writers don't call themselves white writers, they're just writers, whereas for us we have these hyphenated labels or these labels, and that can be exhausting, and there's a lot of expectation, and we can delve into that. But for me, I think so long as that's something that I'm deciding and that I'm sort of defining on my own terms, it's something that I'm going to sort of carry forward with me wherever I am. Identity has its limits. You and I have spoken about this many times before, and I think it's remiss of me to say that even though identity is, as we've talked about, quite important, what I would also say is values are just as critical, if not more. And so that's something that I also find, I'm in community with people who wear a diversity of identities, but because we share values and connect and are in these struggles, that for me is a lot more potent. And ultimately, we're doing that. We are people who have been dispossessed, but we're complicit in dispossession here. What are my responsibilities as a person, not just as a writer and artist, but as a person being on stolen land? What does that look like? What are my responsibilities, my privileges, and my roles here in that struggle as well? So, it's not a straightforward question, but I hope that I did it justice in responding in a very sort of layered way.
Thank you. Yes, that you definitely addressed the point, and I think maybe just adding to that, the limits of identity, but also the fact that when we talk about the Palestinian experience, that even within the Palestinian experience, and this is something that Antony touched on, the diversity or the shift within the Jewish community, we also, I think it's important to highlight the diversity and defend the diversity within the Palestinian community as well, and also constantly keep thinking about ways in which we create more space for all to capture the entirety of the Palestinian experience, which can be, challenging sometimes, because obviously in the way that the settler colonial project, the Israeli state works, and how, create all of those compartments where you have Palestinians in 1948, or Israel, and then you have West Bank, and then now you have the siege on Gaza, and then you have refugees in refugee camps, and then you have the diaspora, and then you have Palestinians in Jerusalem who have a completely different and unclear legal status. So all this stuff, like it can get challenging, but I think it's important that we insist that we provide if we are basically interested in providing a well-rounded and well-informed view of what it means to be a Palestinian and how Palestinians are impacted by the the Zionist Israeli occupation, then we need to kind of endeavor to create that space for a diversity of experiences to be presented. Yes.
I think that's because for a very long time we had no space at all to move, no breathing room, and so when you're fighting for crumbs, you're either going to put forward, the most safest representation, for example, in the Muslim kind of model migrant era. So you're going to put your safest and your most palatable, or you're just going to do the one that's like the most relatively, that seems like the story that's going to connect the most with people. And I know a lot of the time that tends to be, for example, Palestinians from Gaza, but now that we are creating this space in this room, we're able to share all these stories again about the multiplicity of our experiences, which are of course fragmented and fractured in some ways because of our background and our context. And that's why I speak to the different characters and their different portrayals of what it is to be Palestinian and how one deals with the trauma, and that there's not one right way to be Palestinian, but to also resist the inevitability of griefs and traumas that Palestinians are expected to perform. But what I would ultimately say is that, as people who care about justice, and again, that transcends identity, and Antony put it really well when we're talking about Palestine and we care about justice for Palestine, that means we also care about First Nations, and we also understand climate is critical and sort of all these big issues. That to me is kind of what should be the ultimate driver, that we're creating this space and that we're fighting for justice, and that's unconditional. That's not conditional on you liking me as a Palestinian. That's not conditional on you necessarily expecting to understand every single aspect and share and read and know every single story of every single Palestinian experience. Is obviously very, very diverse, and it's wonderful that you might try, but ultimately it should be unconditional, and it should be something that you believe in, not because of any one particular individual, but because it's the kind of moral question, or one of the moral questions of our time.
Thanks, Sara. Antony, just going back to that point where you discussed that shift within the Jewish community, and clearly that is interlinked with the global shift when it comes to public opinion around Palestine. It's getting really hard for the Israeli government, or let's call it the Israeli state, it's getting hard for their allies. It's getting embarrassing for their allies, right? But still, as you wrote in your book, that despite the whole embarrassment around, for instance, Ben-Gvir or Smotrich and all of their racist, like fascist, there's no other way to describe it other than fascist remarks, also being, they're admitting that themselves. It's getting embarrassing for their allies, specifically, the US sometimes, or the EU, to keep normalizing or accepting, provide that kind of welcoming that they would normally, that they have been providing for other leaders, for other governments. Despite that fact, they still continue supporting when it comes to training. They've been training, we know that there's been ongoing training with Israeli and the US, and the US Army, the whole, exchange of and trade with arms, the whole financial support. So that's ongoing. Nothing has changed there. It's just seeing on the surface that they're not, being as nice, basically, or polite as they have been previously. So there's that shift. It's getting really awkward and embarrassing for allies on the surface. And then there's also that shift locally as well. Generally here, speaking in Australia, we saw 2 years ago protests, 20,000 people came out here in Melbourne to support the Sheikh Jarrah protest as well. And I guess my question, all of this context is leading to that. How is that shift being reflected within the Jewish community here in Australia? And where do you see the trajectory of that heading?
Well, it's a good question. I think there's a few things going on here. I think what's happening on the surface is that there are a number of very strong pro-Israel groups, both here in Australia and elsewhere, at least the cleverer ones, if you could use that term, that realise that Israel's got a bit of a PR problem. The savvy ones recognise that. That doesn't mean those groups suddenly have abandoned Israel, not at all. But at least they put out occasional statements saying we really don't agree with fascism, which is nice. But at the deeper level, I think what is happening, and this is more reflected in the US, but it's definitely happening here as well. The latest study I saw was a few months ago, which was done of Australian Jews, which found that 80% of Australian Jews still said that they are Zionists. So that's not surprising. But what is surprising about that, a bit disappointing, but not surprising, is that there is profound, I can't remember the word that was used, but there is profound unease about what's happening by the Israeli government. Now the question is what happens to that feeling? Does it lead to a Jewish community in Australia like what's happening in the US, which is where I am, and I talk about this in the book and I've written about it elsewhere. What's happening in the US and the Jewish community is worth mentioning a few words about, because that in some ways I think is very encouraging. What I call it is a Jewish insurgency within the Jewish community in the US. And what I mean by that is that you still have the pro-Israel lobbies doing their thing, the APACs and others, okay. Supporting Israel 110%, but also supporting, for example, the last year's Republicans who didn't even accept Joe Biden winning the election. So they've kind of gone down a quasi-far-right path. But what is happening in the younger Jewish community, and it's generally a generational thing, it's not quite as neat as that, but generally a generational issue where younger Jews increasingly, in large numbers, are saying a few things. One, not in my name. I no longer will support Israel critically simply because my parents or grandparents, or because I'm told by my rabbi, or because of the Holocaust, or whatever the reason may be that I've been given as a Jew when I'm growing up. Secondly, it's so blatant and obvious what's happening in Palestine just by reading the news, going online, seeing social media, whatever it may be, that I, as a Jew, this is what a lot of American Jews say, are deeply ashamed and either do two things, either disengage entirely, or, which is more encouraging, they get involved in groups that are very involved, trying to change both the Jewish community but also the wider community, so trying to impact public opinion, try to impact the Democratic Party, for example. And there was an interesting poll a few years ago, which I quote in my book, which was young Jews between 18 to 35. This is American Jews saying this, not the wider community, American Jews, a quarter of whom said Israel was an apartheid state, a quarter of whom said Israel was practicing ethnic cleansing. Now, I don't want to exaggerate and say all American young Jews are on board. They're not. But what I'm saying is that sort of poll result is unimaginable 10 years ago. The question is now, where does that go? What happens to that critical Jewish support? Now, in some cases, for example, there's various large Jewish groups, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is anti-Zionist, BDS supporting, I think probably the largest in terms of membership in the US. Does a lot of interesting, important work on the streets and also online. There's groups like If Not Now, which comes from a initially more critical perspective, which is putting pressure on politicians and others to be more critical towards Israel-Palestine. There are a range of groups, people can Google those, and there are others. And what the attempt now is, or the effort in the US is to try to put pressure there from the political system. The Democrats, particularly Republicans, are arguably a lost cause. I would say if Trump, for example, wins next year, just as a brief aside, apart from the profound trauma of that possibility, I think it's interesting to notice on that, and this is not at all a defence of Trump, don't worry, but I think it's important to note when Trump was president for those glorious 4 years, he merely accelerated on Palestine what was happening anyway. Let's be clear, Biden is president now for 2+ years. Do you think anything has changed? He's continued the status quo that Trump accelerated. Now, I'm not minimising the threat of a second term for Trump on a range of issues, immigrants, Palestinians, God knows who else, Black Americans. It's a threat, and I'm not minimising any of that. But I think it's important to note that I think too much in the Western press, in my view, we obsess over people like Netanyahu and Trump. They are problematic figures and we should attack them 24/7. However, the issue in Israel or the US is not just Trump and Netanyahu. Trump's coalition, so to speak, Netanyahu's coalition, Netanyahu is a moderate, in inverted commas, in the Israeli far-right coalition space. People in his cabinet are far more extreme than he is. He's obviously the Prime Minister. I'm not excusing him, don't get me wrong here. I'm not excusing him. What I'm saying here is that there is an utter obsession, and people like Gideon Levy, who's an amazing Israeli journalist and friend of mine, often writes his columns in the Israeli press and says, the left, talking about the Israeli left, is obsessed with Netanyahu, as if somehow, if he falls tomorrow, let's be clear, he was not Prime Minister last year for roughly a year. The settlements didn't end, in fact they accelerated. Last year was, until this year, the most violent year for Palestinians in 2 decades. So the idea that somehow replacing Netanyahu with who? Someone who is just a bit less racist or right-wing? On the issues that matter, as people like Gideon and many others have said for years, Israeli Jewish friends of mine, Palestinian Jewish friends of mine, the situation there will not change from within. Doesn't mean there aren't amazing people there doing amazing work. I'm not minimising any of that. But like with South African apartheid, anyone who speaks to was involved in that issue decades ago will say, white South Africans didn't wake up one morning and say, this apartheid's pretty awful, better end it. It happened that way. There were people who fought it internally, black and white, to be sure. But the pressure had to come from outside. And that's exactly what is needing to happen with Israel and Palestine. And without outside pressure, boycott, divestment, sanctions, cutting military ties, a range of other things, that Israel is made to be a pariah. And finally, on this point, the reason I think the Israeli arms industry is so central to Israel's success, I use that term loosely, is it's an insurance policy. Because there is an awareness in much of the Israeli elites that a lot of the world does not like the occupation. Some don't mind it at all, some love it, but many don't like it. But if you're selling weapons to so many people around the world, are they likely to come out and criticise you where it matters? They're not, because they don't. And I think just finally, Israel, of course, is also banking and hoping on the fact, even if so-called liberal America, liberal Jews turn the other way, turn against them, what they're hoping is the right, the far right, and evangelicals will replace them. So the challenge is not just to get so-called liberals, progressives, call them whatever you want, on board. As I talk about in the book, the threat to me comes, frankly, from a global far right, which increasingly, traditionally, let's be honest, is far-right, neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic and anti-everything. They embrace Israel. They embrace Israel for the vision that it is, because they want to create in their own countries a far-right, ethno-nationalist Christian state in Europe, the US, wherever it may be. That is, to me, the next threat. And I don't think enough people are aware of that threat that exists.
Thanks, Anthony. You do mention in your book, and you spoke about Netanyahuism, and then about Israel being the model that other countries, or other governments around the world aspire to replicate. And that's absolutely something that resonates as well from a Palestinian perspective. The whole discussion around, is it a Netanyahu thing? Is it a Ben Gvir thing? Is it, trying to kind of reduce the issue of what happens, or the root causes of what happens in Palestine, into individuals and individual politics such as Trump or Netanyahu is clearly misses the point, because we know that it's a systemic issue, and it's an issue of a structure and an environment that has been producing these characters and empowering them. And it, like, from a Palestinian perspective, as someone who grew up, was born, raised, and grew up in Israel, there's, when it comes to Palestine and the rights of the Palestinian people, self-determination, equal living, there's no difference, from within the Israeli political spectrum, whether it's left or right, whether it's Meretz, who, despite being on the left, also supports Israeli army and Israeli soldiers and wishes them good luck when they're dropping bombs on Gaza, or whether it's Ben Gvir, who's openly saying, sorry Muhammad, excuse Mr. Khan Muhammad, my right as a Jew in the West Bank, trumps your right, my right to live free, to move freely, trumps your right to have safe living on your ancestral land. So I think so it's important to make that point, that from a Palestinian perspective, there is no difference, and the whole protests that we're seeing or that were happening within the, Israeli domestic politics when it comes to democracy, clearly that leaves the Palestinians outside of that discussion and that discourse. So no one is defending democracy that includes Palestinians. They're talking about democracy that allows Israeli soldiers, once they're done, with their service, to go and hang out at the beach and have beer and relax, on Yafa and Haifa and whatnot. So that's the kind of democracy that's being, democracy, quote unquote, that is being defended. Sara, so you are an organizer, you're a writer, a poet. Your book, the protagonist in your book is a teenager, a young Jamila. Yes, there's also Noel. I love this name, and not because my mom's name is Noel, but anyways. How difficult is it for a young Palestinian writer to be published in Australia nowadays? And I ask this question, and I think about all the trailblazers such as Samah Sabawi, whose work was, and Samah as a person was targeted because of her work, writing and art. I think about Mahir Mughrabi as well. I think about other writers like Randa, Fatah Mikela, Sahar, and other Palestinian writers who have, paved the way, started paving the way in one way or another. And what is it like for you now, being published as a writer? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part is, what do we need to do to ensure that we keep creating and holding space for younger, emerging writers so that they can sit where you are sitting today?
I love that. I think I've been very lucky because, as you said, for me to be able to say that, I'm a writer and sit here and share, my debut novel, obviously that is because of a series of a series of communal generosities, and I didn't do it alone, and I definitely stand on the shoulders of those who have fought and have, and are continuing to fight to create space for us and to make sure that we're able to share our stories in this way. So I think, it's probably, there's a lot, there's a big shift globally, I think, in, as we already know, in kind of representation of communities of color and Black communities and First Nations here in Australia specifically, if we're talking about that. So there's this almost is sort of a resurgence of literature and art and movies and TV shows that are now more diverse. And the cynic in me would say that a lot of that is driven by profit and knowing that that's something that is up for consumption, and it's very coming from a very extractive sort of mindset. But I also know that there are a lot of people behind the scenes working in those spaces, whether it's not just having diverse actors or slapping on a bit of color and saying, yep, this is, we're diverse and we're telling an important story. It's actually because there are writers and producers and all these people behind the scenes playing a role so that we have space to share our stories. So I think for me, it's being able to continue to do that, continue to nurture artists and continue to create these pathways and mentor young people to be able to do this and share our stories in a way that is true to our experiences so that we can continue to share them and not have someone share them on our behalf. So I don't, whilst I do think it's profitable, I also think it's because we have made it undeniable, now that we have the space to tell our stories, we're doing it, and we're doing it in a way where we actually have created or kind of redistributed power. So, and I think that's really important to understand as well, to understand that we have power to do this, and we have power to push back, and we have power to share these stories in different ways, and to be able to elevate and make space for other people is so important. So, supporting community organizations, I don't want to name drop FPM or AJDS or even APAN, but I think, these are community organizations that are creating pockets of space for young people to be mentored, to be trained, to have the skills and the confidence to go out there and do so many critical things in advocacy and otherwise, and to share our stories, and to do it in a way where they understand the context, because let's not be fooled, we have so much work to do. It's not over. As I said earlier, there's no point in having representation or identity if it's going to be, it's sort of like what we were saying earlier, the IDF on Twitter posting about feminism is like genocide but make it feminist, or genocide but make it vegan. So these posts where they're just performing these values, but actually for me, I'm really interested in creating genuine spaces where we have altar spaces, almost what Hash calls, where we have the power and we're doing it in a way that is honoring of our values and doing it in a way that is very ethical and coming from a place of care and compassion. So, lots of different avenues, but I think for me it's always about starting local and understanding that these oppressions that we're fighting, these systems, whether it's police and prisons in Australia as a manifestation of colonialism, or much more explicit checkpoints and settlements and so on in so-called Israel, those are manifestations of colonialism. It is around the world, these institutions of white supremacy, and for us, art is one way, but actually organizing and reaching critical mass transnationally, globally, is the only way to fight these kind of global oppressive systems.
Thank you for that beautiful answer, Sara. So one last question, and then we'll open the space for questions from the audience. So here we are sitting, Antony and Sara, talking about two different books, two different genres, but that are connected around the theme of Palestine and human rights and identity and what it means to be, born in a certain way and having a certain lived experience, and how that shapes you and shapes your views. What took to bring you guys here together? Like, aside from Free Palestine Melbourne and AJDS, what took that? I mean, how did we create this bridge? I guess this is my question. And how do we continue creating more bridges between the Arab Palestinian Muslim community and the Jewish community here in Australia and the diaspora? Yeah, thanks.
I'll just say quickly that at the end of the day, again, it's about understanding the intersections that we inhabit and what that means. So yes, we have an onus to educate ourselves and access as best we can with the resources that we can and the language that we have. We have that responsibility to educate, but we also have a responsibility to go out there and be part of movements, wider movements for social justice. And when we're fighting against Islamophobia or against colonialism here, that necessarily means that we're also against anti-Semitism, and understanding that our movements are intersectional and connected, and that's not just a tokenistic or symbolic thing, but actually that it operates on a much deeper level. It always is going to start locally and with community, and you work your way up. So I think for me that is one of the biggest or sort of most foundational steps moving forward about how we are able to continue to build and continue to fight, because at this point in time, it's going, climate for me is something that I'm constantly having existential dread about, and it's at the heart, of a lot of these movements and these spaces as well. So that's something that I would imagine that whether you're Jewish or Palestinian or Muslim or the other intersections we inhabit, like that's something that we would be worried about, and we would be out there fighting and active on and using every single resource that we have, to battle. And ultimately, because I'm an artist, so I guess I'm going to say this from an artistic kind of perspective, or that's one of the things that I do. Art doesn't necessarily, art isn't going to bring down the apartheid wall in Palestine. It's not going to end, this government's unjust refugee policies or shut down the detention centers on Radisson or, down the road. The art's function isn't that, but amongst many other things, for me, art is something that allows us to create language and thought and move people into meaningful action. So for me, fundamentally, language and art and being able to show people the world and an alternative world, you know, imagine a different path, different frameworks and ways of being moving forward. That transformative imagination is critical to transformative politics. So for me, it's always going to be, in one sense, you know, the artists as some of the most important, but also the journalists and other sort of truth tellers and people who are fighting. Just interestingly, I don't know if you know this, because I don't think you've read my book yet, but there is a part where in reading your book, you talk about Chile. And I was like, oh my God, I have a character who's also Chilean, and you know, what you were doing with that, I was doing with this one particular character, but obviously in a very sort of different way, with the kind of the underlying principle and showing the solidarities and how people's experiences can be opening. And then you wrote about Sabra and Shatila, the massacre, of course, in Lebanon, 1982, and I was like, oh my God, there's a really horrific scene in the book, without giving any spoilers away, where I talk about Sabra and Shatila. And so that was something that I, you know, found quite, quite amusing, that there were different parts that, you know, that worked in parallel, almost these synchronicities, but me as an artist finding my own way to share these stories about these pivotal moments, and obviously doing it in a very different way to you, even Nakba, for example, and other things. And so I just thought I wanted to share that because I thought it was really like a really beautiful way to kind of ground this or program this.
Just to briefly explain what Sara said there with Chile, because it's worth saying, because for those I'm sure are aware that there's a 50th anniversary on 9/11 this month of the US-backed coup in Chile, and the reason I mention it in the context of this is, what most people don't know, is that Israel was also very involved with the Pinochet regime as well. I talk about that quite a lot in the book, that the US obviously was the key driver, and I might add so was Australia. So that's just a bit of context for that. But one of the things that really has struck me for a long time, and I say this as someone who grew up in Melbourne in the Jewish community, I did not go to a Jewish school, but I grew up in the Jewish community. One of the key things I think that really, that was a failure for me in a way, is as growing up, and I think this needs to change a lot, is I have no recollection of meeting Palestinians for maybe the first 20 years of my life. Now obviously my whole life wasn't about Israel and Palestine, it was about growing up and going to school, but I have no recollection of meeting a Palestinian. I was not introduced to Palestinians through my school, I went to a Jewish Sunday school to prepare myself for a bar mitzvah. I have no recollection of meeting Palestinians through the synagogue my family used to go to. And that's a problem, sort of self-evidently a problem. Now, I think what needs to change, and I think it's just slowly changing with younger Jews, and I'm not going to speak obviously about the Palestinian community, but in the Jewish community, it's sort of obvious to say this, but unless you spend time with someone who's from the so-called opposite side, your views are going to be very limited at best. That doesn't mean that every Jew who doesn't meet a Palestinian is going to have terrible views. It's not as simple as that. But it's a problem. And to me, at the moment, there is still a real push in many Jewish schools in Melbourne and Sydney and elsewhere to almost try to shield their students from the reality in Palestine. I say that based on the fact that many of the principals of these schools in Melbourne and Sydney and elsewhere are very hardline Zionists, very pro-Israel, and they want to bring that attitude within their students. And not every student's going to go that line, I understand that. But unless you are, as a young person, meeting, say, a Palestinian, spending time with them, understanding them, hearing each other's stories, hearing what those narratives are, they're going to be profoundly different. Until that changes, and I think it is, from my understanding, changing in parts of the younger Jewish community. There is obviously younger Jews who meet Palestinians, of course there are, but in general it's still very limited. And I think that is a real block to a potential of what you asked, Noura, which is far more connection, public events. Obviously there are public events with Jews and Palestinians, it's not the first one, there'll be hopefully thousands more. I do see it happening a lot more overseas. I see it happening in parts of the US regularly. I see it happening in the UK regularly. I hear it much less here. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's rare. And I think there are a range of reasons for that. I think people are in their own silos. There's a lot of reasons, not all necessarily awful, evil reasons. But I think there is still a block amongst, and again, I can only speak for many in the Jewish community, there is still a block amongst many, although it's changing, and younger Jews particularly, their views are changing very fast. Not all, but many, because of the reasons we said before, because of the Israeli government, because of the apartheid, because of the occupation, because of all those reasons. But until there's more, I'm not talking about meeting with communities as peace building. I'm not talking about this idea, which has often been pushed by many liberal groups, of if only the Israelis and Palestinians got in a room and just sort of worked it out, everything would be fine. That's not what I'm saying. Obviously, in Israel and Palestine, there's profound power differentiation. There's an occupation, an occupier, an occupier. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's Jews and Palestinians getting together and just interacting, understanding, and listening to each other's stories. That has to happen so much more, younger and older. And I see it happening a lot more overseas than here, and it's an issue. And I think it should be encouraged and pushed. And of course, just finally, there are many pressures in the Jewish community for that not to happen, because there is an understanding amongst the cleverer, savvier Jewish leaders, if you can call them that. I would say they're self-described leaders, that it's actually a threat to hear a different narrative. And because a Jewish person hears a Palestinian, doesn't automatically make them a supporter of BDS. Of course not. Some yes, but not all. But the idea of hearing far more Palestinian voices, Palestinians in general, it sounds far from, this is not a radical idea. I'm not proposing something radical. It doesn't happen that much. And it should. And the reasons why people are mostly against that, many elements in the Jewish community, is because they know that they want to maintain what has been Australia's case for years, which is a very strong pro-Israel community, and they also want to encourage, which is seen as a danger by many Jewish leaders here and overseas, an intermarriage. That you regularly hear Jewish leaders saying it is a threat to us and our future if you marry someone who's not Jewish. Your kids will not be Jewish. And the idea that we are still having those kinds of conversations and paranoias and frankly racist discussions in 2023 must be called out far more than it is.
The other thing is, just really quickly, the Black Lives Matter movement matters. Black Lives Matter movement in the context of this colony as well. So just very quickly, because I think it has also been super critical in the shift, just the ability for us to have conversations around what it is to exist in a colonial project, or what even is colonialism. I mean, 10 years ago, 5 years ago maybe even, just having a conversation around that word would probably attract punishment, if not in the very least an explanation, and need to have to like elaborate and defend and sort of just really explain what that means and why we think that, for example, Israel is a settler colonial project. And so being in the context that is very much led by Black communities in Australia, staunch Black activists, staunch Black women, very much indebted to the fact that they have been able to shift the conversation, and we have been able to then use that as an opening and aim to have these discussions to talk about colonialism and Black Palestinian solidarity in the context of here has been such a formative part of, I think, the advocacy and the activism, perhaps more so on the left. But I do see that as one of the biggest factors that has created change for us, or that has helped accelerate what the movement has been trying to do, or has been doing for decades. And I suspect that that's something that's going to be a pain point moving forward for the Zionist lobby, in the sense that they're going to want to try very hard, and they probably already have, in speaking to, and I mean, we're seeing that with the Voice at the moment, and certain individuals being part of that, and part of that conversation, and representing themselves as critical. Still very problematic views on Palestine. So I guess, yeah, the point is that I really just wanted to flag that as well, because I think it's such a crucial part of the conversation, especially at least for Palestinian organizers and organizing on this colony.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. Just quickly on that, and it's, why is it not happening enough as much as it should be? And this might be an unpopular opinion here, but I think it's a must. I worked with solidarity movements and civil society organizations and groups in Europe, in Asia, and in Australia. And when it comes to human rights issues and civil society being, empowered, clearly, I noticed, and this is an anecdote, I noticed that there is a difference. Australia is still catching up on all of these issues. Even when it comes to Black Lives Matter, Australia is still catching up. So I think that might be a factor. And definitely that was not a question about how do we build bridges in Palestine, Israel, because for bridges to be built there, the occupation needs to end. Like, there's no question. Especially given the complicity of the Israeli society in the enactment of the occupation, given that, Israeli, the military service there is mandatory. Some can actually, there's a way out, and some choose to spend 6 months in prison. And there are options, obviously, but the majority of Israelis continue to serve in the Israeli army. And given how the indoctrination process starts from a very early age, and that's one, once again, this is being involved as a teacher when I was teaching in Akka and in Nazareth, being involved in those programs where you get to, let's build bridges together, let's sit together and talk it out, let's have a room. The problem is because we don't talk to each other. That's not the problem. The problem is because you have an asymmetric conflict where on one side you have a fully armed soldier that is pointing their weapon at 5 years old. Right? The problem is that you have a system that is built on Jewish supremacy. And the problem is that that system, responsible, the ideology behind it, but also the system is responsible for crimes against humanity. And the problem is that that system sees people like myself, like Sara, and like my children as a threat, as a demographic threat. So I think until we have all these barriers removed in Palestine, then we can start building bridges. Though some bridges are being built in Palestine, and they're around co-resistance. And I think this is probably the theme that we have here as well, and that connects to that point that you raised earlier, Sara, about values, as well as saying yourself, Antony, around social justice, human rights, and potentially, I can see this kind of community being built around co-resistance, shared values around social justice, human rights. Thank you so much, Sara and Antony, for your input and for this lovely evening. Please, guys, give them a to the cause, to the movement, and now I'd like to open the space for questions. Take a question from the floor. Let's start with Larry.
Thanks a lot. I'm Larry Stillman from AJBS. A whole lot of really interesting issues being raised on suffering, trauma, and so on. But first of all, look, unfortunately, I really have to call out Anthony for his remarks about Jews and intermarriage. If I, at a Muslim forum, or working with Muslims, as I do, had a go at them for wanting their children to marry up on Muslim society, you would call that racist and disgraceful. To say that in front of a group of non-Jews and reinforce that perception that Jews don't intermarry or don't want to be connected to anyone else is frankly fucking wrong. It's disgraceful that you said that. I'll call you out on it quite strongly, and I think everyone else here agrees with me. Okay. Now, what I want to add is, I think on the issues of...
Larry, just quickly, just on that, just to let you know, even within the Muslim community, like I'm a Muslim, my husband's Hindu, and even in my community, it's not very common. So I think that probably it's not necessarily a Jewish thing. I
know this. I'm intermarried. I don't
yes.
have a problem having intermarried.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
But for Anthony to add this into a discussion about Melbourne Jews, I think, is really offensive in
the rest of your question, but just wanted to point out that I even within the Muslim community, that's not very common. I mean, you get people like myself who are, married to non-Muslims, and they have a mixed marriage as well, also in Palestine, but we can't say that's the majority of us, so,
So I wouldn't necessarily refer to it as racist.
I wanted to answer the rest of my questions. Ask the rest of my questions. So, concepts like trauma, erasure, suffering, no middle ground, identity, human rights came up. And that's absolutely fantastic. But what I also heard was the reinforcement of stereotyping on both sides. And I've called it out once here. And Australian Jews and others stereotype Palestinians. Now, in this situation, unless we move forward, we can't move forward. We can't move forward. And it's a difficult and traumatic issue. And I think that in interaction between communities, we have to both sides have to admit it is not equally, it is traumatic for each other's reasons. And we've got to respect that. So I want a response to that without stereotyping. Thank you.
I mean, I guess although it bores me deeply, but I will say something about the intermarriage issue. The idea that elements in the Australian Jewish community, American Jewish community, Israel's current president, has spent years and years and years saying the threat of Jews who marry out is akin to the Holocaust. That's their words, not mine. That's their words. So my partner's not Jewish as well. The idea that suggests it's offensive to call out Jews who use that kind of language, that's what they're saying. They themselves are talking about how it is akin to a Holocaust if Jews do not marry Jews. Now, many Jews don't marry Jews. Obviously you don't, and I haven't either. But I would call it out. If communities are saying we should only stick to ourselves because of the Holocaust, that's why the Jewish leaders are saying that. And to me, it's moral blackmail, not by you, but those leaders to say, if you marry someone non-Jewish, you essentially are akin to a non-Jew. We will not recognise your children at their synagogues. That is what's happening. And you know it's happening now, all the time. So I will call that out because that is racism. The idea that a Jewish synagogue would not regard a child born in a mixed marriage as not Jewish, is that not racism? I would say the same to a mosque. If it was the equivalent situation, I would say the same any other religion. The fact that it's Jews, I'm Jewish. I call it out in a range of other religions as well. I've spent years working in the Middle East talking about racism within the Muslim community, about other communities. It's not just because they're Jewish. I'm equally against, for example, a Hindu state or a Christian state. It happens to be that I'm Jewish and therefore I'm complicit in Israel because I'm Jewish, right? So the idea that you would dare say to me that somehow it's racist to call out racism? Okay, I don't even know how to respond to that beyond that. But anyway, apart from the other issue of trauma, I mean, I'm happy to... Apart from the issue of trauma, look, obviously, I think there is profound trauma in the Jewish community and the Palestinian community because of history, because of the Holocaust, because of the Nakba, because of the way Palestinians are treated, the way many Jews are treated, but how frankly many Jews in some parts of the world face increasing anti-Semitism. But the idea that there is a, not that you're suggesting this, but there is a moral or ethical equivalence between the communities. What I think many, and I'm not suggesting you guys by the way, but many in the Jewish community have not yet accepted is, in general, they have gone from a community which has been incredibly weak to powerful. And they have not, they've internalised the fact that they are still the victim. Now, of course, there are Jews who are victims. Of course, there are Jews who face real anti-Semitism. I'm not denying any of that. And I talk about that extensively. But in general, half a century ago, many institutions wouldn't employ someone because they were Jewish. That was common in Australia, the US, much of Europe. Today, it happens sometimes, but it's pretty rare. Whereas it does happen regularly across American universities if someone comes out, Jewish or Muslim, and criticises Palestine. They're not given a job. They're fired. Whatever it may be, they're cancelled for those views. So yes, I think it is totally legitimate to talk about what Jewish power means in the 21st century and the complicity that we have and the responsibility we have. Palestinians have agency. I'm not suggesting they're all victims. They're not. They have agency and they act how they act. It's not from my place to... I have criticisms of Palestinian groups. I have criticisms of the PA. The PA is corrupt. Hamas are corrupt. I've said that for 20 years. But it's not my place to say what Palestinians should do to change that in Palestine. I have views about it, and I've written and talked about it, but ultimately it's a Palestinian issue, is how I would see it.
Thank you. Michael?
I've got a question for Antony Loewenstein. In your book, you document how the Israeli arms company Elbit Systems displayed a promotional video in which one of its drones killed several Palestinian civilians, including children. You also document how Elbit Systems is involved in a mass surveillance system on the US-Mexico border, which systematically harasses Native Americans and migrants. Now, currently, RMIT is partnering with Elbit Systems on a Centre of Excellence to develop artificial intelligence and drone technology. Does this make RMIT complicit in human rights abuses committed using Elbit technology? And do you support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions against companies like Elbit Systems? Thank you.
I mean, the short answer is yes and yes, but I will say a little bit more than that. For those who don't know, and Michael gave a bit of an explanation, Elbit is Israel's biggest defence company. It works all around the world. It is complicit in a range of areas, and it's interesting that RMIT and I might add the Victorian government, particularly the Victorian government, also the many other governments statewide, the Australian government, both under the former Liberal government and the current Labor government, maintains deep ties not just to Elbit but the Israeli defence architecture. I think RMIT, I know we're in RMIT, so high management, but it seems to me that the fact that they need to feel profound pressure to end that, profound pressure to end that, and to understand what exactly they're supporting. Now, I think it's interesting how, and I think Sara, of course, was one of the main leaders behind the boycott the last few years against the Sydney Festival, which on the one hand is a totally separate issue to here, but the thinking behind it is exactly the same. It's exactly the same. At the moment, we have a situation where RMIT, the Victorian government, the federal government, it's normal, in inverted commas, to partner with Israel. This is seen as normal, uncontroversial, doesn't get much attention, it's bipartisan support. I do welcome the fact that I have no connection to the Greens, I'm not a member of the Greens, to preface my comment by saying that. But the new Greens policy on Israel-Palestine is a fantastic policy because it talks, A, about cutting military ties between Israel and Australia, and also it calls out the idea and justifies boycotts against companies like Elbit, which I support, as in support that boycott. So yes, I think RMIT needs to, well, be profoundly challenged on that, and And in terms of the Victorian government, when the Victorian government, I think it was 2021, announced some kind of huge investment in Elba to apparently develop drones for non-military use, so potentially use drones to help, I guess, with bushfires. Now, on the face of it, drones can have a place for that kind of use. I don't deny that for a second. However, if you partner as a state or a university with a company like Elbit, you have blood on your hands. Because the record of Elbit in Israel, Palestine, the US-Mexico border and elsewhere is so damn clear. So RMIT needs to answer very serious questions about it, and they should feel pressure about that, a lot of pressure.
Elbit was shut down, as we know, in the UK because of the fierce work of activists who continue day in, day out and put their bodies on the line. And I think for us, that's something that we really need to be thinking about in terms of drawing attention to that. And so for people who want more information, obviously BDS up on their website has a lot on Elbit, not just in Australia, but its complicity elsewhere and with governments around the world. And I mean, it is certainly feels a little bit like very much endless, but not without hope, I think, because it can be a bit overwhelming to look at these things big picture. But the other thing that I found really interesting is, Larry, you actually mentioned to me just before we started, to Antony and I, that there was an article in The Guardian today on Australia's exports to Saudi Arabia, and there seems to be a lot of arms exports to Saudi Arabia, and obviously the complicity in terms of those arms and those weapons being used in wars against civilian populations in Yemen. And this is not new. This is something that activists and advocates have been calling for here and elsewhere in the UK and other Western governments, so-called Western governments, to cut off their ties and to stop selling arms to Saudi. Something that I wholeheartedly support. What I do find very interesting is the lack of media coverage around when Elbit and this deal was happening, and the pressure that we tried to put, and again drawing attention to this, and the campaign, the boycott campaign, how media outlets don't seem to want to touch it or go near it. And so these are exactly the kinds of links that we should be making, that if we are going to have articles and have campaigns and have government and politicians and people talk about, as we should, Australia selling arms exports to Saudi, then we need to be doing the same and drawing these links to Israel and digging much deeper and asking bigger questions.
Fantastic point, Sara. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry. Oh, thank you so much. Oh. Hello. Oh, true. Thank you. Yeah, I'm a student at RMIT, and I'm part of Students for Palestine, as well as Books Not Bombs campaign at RMIT. Especially, one of the things that politicized me specifically was Palestine. I remember having a debate in high school with one of my best friends about Zionism and how we should oppose the Gal Gadot and Wonder Woman, the movie, when we went to watch it in the cinema. Yeah, I think I just wanted to touch on young people and ideas, and are young people touching on Free Palestine? Do they care about it? Well, the answer is yes, because today I've been campaigning all day for the ticket social justice as part of getting activists in RUSU, the RMIT Student Union, and I had someone who came up to me and said, "Free Palestine? That's all that matters to me. I care about that," and grabbed one of my tickets and straight away voted for us. I think that the thing is that right now we're at a period where there are lots of things that are happening to young people. We're living through a cost of living crisis and economic crises. We're seeing, black people being killed by the police in France, in the US. I was reading that article as well about Saudi, about Australia selling 21 massive arms deal to Saudi Arabia to basically kill Yemeni people. I think it's really, really appalling. So that's the first thing I want to say. I think the second thing is about liberation. question. The question is, how do we fight for a free Palestine? And I think that this comes through, yes, I agree, activism and thinking about the UK example. Well, what was that example? It was about activists and unionism. It was about shutting down a company. It was about, going on strike. And I think that, one of the things that are happening at RMIT is next week we're going to go on strike on Wednesday the 13th to fight for higher wages, to fight to get more Aboriginal employees in the university because of the systemic racism of RMIT. That's some of the stuff that's happening. I think talking about liberation and how striking and working class politics plays with that is in Indonesia, when we were fighting for our national liberation against colonialism, it was the Dutch colonies that actually were part of enslaving hundreds and thousands and maybe millions of Indonesians. Actually, what happened was, it was the solidarity of international working class people that helped and abided in getting rid of Dutch colonialism. One of those things was Australian trade unionists. They actually boycotted Dutch goods to support the fight for Indonesian liberation. Well, that was one thing, and obviously Indonesia is an independent country now, so that's real proof of working class solidarity. Another one is South African apartheid. We're talking about Palestine. This is an Israel, Israel as an apartheid state. One of the things that happened in Australia was that Qantas airline workers, they went on strike and they refused to move, actually take in South African officials on their plane. They refused to move the rugby team, Springboks, who were part of the racist regime. And I think that's a really, really important thing. Same with the wolfies and the dock workers. They refused South African goods to support the liberation movement in South Africa. So those are a couple of things. My question for both of you guys, Antony and Sara, is about, well, one for Antony is more so we saw the strikes in the UK and the effect and the protests over there. I was wondering whether, I have yet to read your book, and I'm going to buy it today, which is really cool. Have you written much about the potential for workers who are part of these companies that are so crucial and core to the running of Israel, about the possibility of strike action, and whether there are other examples either in the UK that you've talked about? And for Sara, I guess in the same way, in your sort of writing and in your book, was there an example of maybe a protest movement, maybe in the Lebanon Civil War, and how that sort of affected your characters as well? A couple more questions, and then we'll answer those points.
Want your energy.
Harold.
I'm Harold Saleh from Australian Educator Society. In the discussion today, there's been the use of the words terms like Zionism and apartheid, and those things mean very different things to people on each side of this. So, in the Jewish community, for instance, any mention of the word apartheid immediately means what it was in South Africa. Zionist in the Jewish community is a very broad sort of a label. It doesn't define a particular way of thinking about Israel, although it represents people who support Israel, not necessarily the policies of the government, but the idea of a Jewish state. So I wonder whether you could perhaps unpack those words like Zionism and apartheid in the way that you understand them.
Thank you for that question. Amar? Yeah.
Thank you to both the speakers. My question is about the far right, which both of you mentioned in different ways. Antony, in relation to the global situation in Europe and the US. Sara, in relation to the war on terror, the growth of groups like Reclaim Australia, and more recently, the National Socialist Network that some of us have been organising against quite a lot. Could you talk about the impact of the far right politically, maybe in different ways, and its connection to the Israeli state? And can you elaborate on that? Because I think that is one of the reasons why in the US so many progressive Jews are realising this Trump guy that we hate everything he stands for, he's the best friend of the country that we're told represents democracy in the Middle East, you know, something must give here. And here in Australia, with the growth of the far right, they definitely remain anti-Semitic, but for them, Islamophobia and anti-refugee politics is also, you know, very central. So yeah, could you both please elaborate on that? Yeah.
Thank you, Omar. One last question. The lady with the sunglasses. Quite bright.
Hello, I'm Sylvie. I wanted to ask a completely different question of Antony, and it's to do with what's happening with the Eritreans at the moment, and bring in the concept of technology. There's been an issue for many years in Israel about the Horn of African Jews, the Falasha, and does Israel have the technology to identify whether any Horn of African people in Israel are actually Falasha or not Falasha?
Thank you. My understanding is that we have room until 8:30. Is that right, Michael? Great. So we'll try and answer those 4 questions before we're kicked out of the room. I'll actually start by addressing Harold's point about Zionism and apartheid. And I think, Harold was asking, what does that mean for people in the room? What does Zionism mean? What does apartheid mean? Apartheid means apartheid, that you have a system and structure that basically a 2-tier system that addresses different people, different groups of people differently, and in which, you know, in the modern day context, I think apartheid is represented by the state of Israel. And that is not just us Palestinians who have been saying that for decades. It's also, you know, increasingly international organizations, civil rights organizations, such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, but also Israeli rights, civil rights organizations, human rights organizations, such as B'Tselem and others. So I think just, you know, to kind of clarify what we mean, and then to tackle that point of Zionism and what Zionism means to different people. From a Palestinian perspective, and I think also, you know, maybe in the last century, the history of, you know, Zionism and how Zionism came to existence. When we talk about Zionism nowadays, we're not talking about Zionism, the type of Zionism that existed 2,000 years ago. We're not talking about spiritual Zionism, we're not talking about the Zionism, you know, whatever form of Zionism that people may practice in the privacy of their homes. We're talking about Zionism as a political manifestation, as a set of colonial ideology that was inspired by European nationalism. We're talking about Theodor Herzl Zionism, right? And today, the official and formal manifestation of Zionism is the State of Israel. So for me, as a Palestinian who does not fit in any Zionist version, any Zionist world, it's all the same. Zionism created this structure that, you know, Zionism is responsible for crimes against humanity. Zionism is responsible directly to the dispossession of my family, to the murder of my friends, to the fact that I have lost, you know, friends and family members. For what? Why? Just because they were born to the wrong parents? Or the fact that my 2 sons are legitimate targets because they're identified as a threat, because they were born to a Palestinian mother. So that's Zionism to me. It will always be a settler colonial movement that is aggressive, and currently with the current trajectory and the way things are headed and the direction that things are headed in Israel, Zionism is increasingly just becoming a more of an aggressive and violent, I guess, ideology. And that's when, you know, I say there's no spectrum for me. And I know maybe, you know, when you talk about Zionism, you refer to a different type of Zionism, but that's not the one that I have to deal with. That's not the one that we all see nowadays, and that's not the one that, sadly, identifies as a Jewish state. Like, this is the Jewish state, you know, this is Zionism. And then that's the thing, that's the entity that I have to deal with, that is constantly endeavoring and thinking of ways to eliminate me. It doesn't believe I exist. Even though I exist, but it's constantly trying to kill me, but it doesn't believe I exist. So that's Zionism in a nutshell. We are not, and of course we make that distinction clear between Zionism and Judaism. As a Muslim, you know, Muslims pray 5 times a day. And in all of our prayers, we mention Ibrahim, right? As Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Ibrahim, kama sallayta ala Sayyidina Muhammad, kama sallayta ala Sayyidina Ibrahim. Meaning we pray for Abraham, we acknowledge as Muslims and as Arabs the historical, the ancient, but also the rich history of the Jewish link, you know, the Jewish history of the land, but we are not confused about what Zionism is. So for us, it's not a spectrum. You're either Zionist or you're not, and if you're a Zionist, by extension, you don't see me as an equal human being. And I'm talking political Zionism, right? Once again, just to clarify. So that's my answer. So Sara wants to add quickly, and then we move to Antony. Sara, maybe when you're done, do you want to address the unions and the strike as well?
I mean, my first instinct is to ask, what does it matter if you are dispossessing us and expelling us from our homes and seeing us as less than or not giving us our human rights, but doing all of that politely? What does it matter that you're expelling me from my home and dispossessing me, but you're doing it politely? What's the difference between that and doing it with a little boot on my neck and a gun in my face? So I would just ask that instead of wanting me to explain these terms and this language and these words on your terms, that you try and actually see it on our terms and our experience. And perhaps that's actually the starting point that we need to be using, moving forward and being propelled forward, because I think that is exactly what is symbolic of the entire issue, the asymmetry in power, and the fact that we are oppressed and oppressor, and colonized and colonizer, and ultimately that for me is the starting point of every conversation. And there's not really much more to add because I think my sister Noura said it all. Thank you so much for your question. Love your energy, need that in my life. And really appreciate the examples that you've injected into the conversation, because I think it reminds us that we don't need to despair and that there is plenty examples of resistance and success that has worked, and that empires will fall, if not today, not next week, not in our lifetime, that they will soon, inshallah. So on that, I just want to very quickly read this piece, this 2 lines, to respond to your question about how I tackled that in the book. So Jamila would often venture to the shop and find her Baba on his desk, surrounded by empty glasses of black coffee. She sometimes caught him engrossed in political and cultural magazines produced by Palestinian artists and intellectuals and activists who brought their revolutions with them to Beirut in the 60s and the 70s. They started unions and demanded their rights, organized community services in refugee camps, built alliances with local groups, led marches, made art. He'd share stories by Hassan Kanafani, a revolutionary leader and writer who'd been incinerated in a car bomb. His martyrdom still devastated the Palestinian struggle. He introduced her to Najib Ali, he introduced her to Mahmoud Darwish and to Leila Khaled. Just ad-libbing here, but hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. Just quickly, we need to finish actually to leave some space and time for the book signing. So one question that you would like to address, you get to choose anybody. There were 2 questions. There's one about far right and the Iraqis. Just pick one.
With the far right, very briefly, I think what Israel's done for most of its history, but it's accelerated this century, is a growing alliance with far right groups and parties around the world, particularly Europe and elsewhere. Just last week, for example, Israel under its current government is partnering with a far-right neo-Nazi Holocaust denying group in Romania. You can find that online, it was announced last week. These are the kind of alliances that Israel is making with its eyes open. On the face of it, you might say that is insane, why would they do that? They're doing it, I think, for two reasons. One, because I think increasingly the so-called liberal world is turning against Israel. It's been the case for 2 decades and it's accelerating. And secondly, they've seen alliance. I mean, the reason Israel wanted to partner with those far-right group, the far-right party in Romania, why? Because it wanted Romanian support for the occupation. So as the occupation deepens and grows, Romania is one example of many. The book talks a lot about this issue. I think it's a real threat. It's a growing threat, actually. And because those groups view Israel as a model, as an ethno-nationalist model, I think we need to be, A, make more people aware of it and fight against it, because that increasingly, I think, is where Israel is heading. Those kinds of alliances, which again make it pretty damn hard, I would say, for so-called liberal Jews to support, even those who might call themselves Zionists.
I want to thank everyone for bringing yourself, your vulnerability, your identity to this discussion. And I think it's important that we keep creating these spaces for these discussions. Obviously, identities are a hot topic and it's quite a delicate and sensitive topic for us to address. But I do want to acknowledge that, everyone who participated, and thank you once again for the Free Palestine Melbourne crew and the Australian Jewish Democratic Society crew. I look forward for more events like this. Once again, I think it's time that you guys go get your books. Make sure that Antony and Sara write a nice a note and yes, drawings. And Sara draws very well, by the way. Yes, make sure you get your copies, signed copies, and keep connecting with each other and keep connecting with the writers as well.